Here's something they don't tell you about the most desired position in ancient China. You could live your entire life in a palace with the emperor and never once speak to him. Never even see his face. You could die at 70, having spent 57 years waiting in silk-lined rooms, your beauty fading, your name forgotten, your existence amounting to nothing more than a line in a ledger somewhere. Second-class attendant, died of cold, winter 1756. 20,000 women. That's how many concubines lived in the palace during certain Han Dynasty reigns. 20,000. And here's the twist that changes everything. The emperor couldn't possibly visit them all, even if he spent every single night with a different woman for 50 years straight. The mathematics alone made it impossible. So, what were they really there for? That's the question that unravels everything we think we know about imperial harems. Because this isn't a story about romance or desire. It's about a system so vast, so complex, and so brutally efficient at consuming women's lives that it operated for over 2,000 years. And tonight, we're going to step inside those vermillion walls and discover what actually happened when you became imperial property. The girl entering the Forbidden City at age 13 has no idea yet. She thinks she's been chosen for greatness. Her mother wept when the officials came with their scrolls. But were those tears of joy or grief? That's what we're about to find out. The system began modestly enough. Early Chinese dynasties practiced royal polygamy, nothing unusual for ancient monarchies. But something changed during the Qin Dynasty in 221 BCE. Emperor Qin Shi Huang, the man who unified China and built the Great Wall, looked at his court and saw a problem. Too much power concentrated in individual empress families. His solution was elegant and terrible. Why give power to one family through marriage when you could dilute that power across hundreds of families? He created the first formal ranking system for imperial women. Not wives in any meaningful sense, more like a living collection. Each woman representing her family's connection to the throne, but none holding enough status to threaten imperial authority. It was bureaucracy applied to human relationships, and it worked so well that every dynasty afterward copied it. The Han Dynasty, ruling from 206 BCE to 220 CCE, perfected what Qin had started. By the 2nd century CE, during the reigns of Emperor Huan and Emperor Ling, over 20,000 women lived in the palace. Let that number settle. 20,000 women, one emperor. Here's where the mathematics reveal the system's true purpose. If the emperor visited a different woman every single night, it would take 54 years to see them all once. 54 years. Most emperors didn't reign that long, which means the vast majority of these women existed for reasons that had nothing to do with the emperor's personal desires. So what were they really for? Power distribution. Every woman in the harem represented a family who now had a stake in imperial stability. A family who wouldn't rebel because their daughter lived in the palace. A family who might receive honors, wealth, or positions if their daughter bore a son. The harem wasn't about sex. It was about control. It was about creating thousands of threads connecting the emperor to powerful families across China, ensuring loyalty through the bodies of women. The Tang Dynasty between 618 and 907 CE took this administrative approach even further. They organized imperial women into 8 or 9 ranks and called them inner officials, a term suggesting they paralleled the civil service. Because that's exactly what they were, a shadow government within the women's quarters. Female palace officers managed ceremonial affairs, supervised younger women, and controlled resources. If you were selected for the harem, you weren't just becoming a concubine. You were joining a massive household bureaucracy where most positions had nothing to do with the emperor's bed, and everything to do with running a palace complex the size of a small city. The Ming Dynasty, beginning in 1368, brought this system to the newly constructed Forbidden City in Beijing. The massive palace complex, with its maze of courtyards and buildings, became the physical manifestation of the harem's true scale. The walls were 40 feet high. The inner court held thousands of rooms. Once you entered, you might never see the world beyond those walls again. The Qing Dynasty, established by Manchu conquerors in 1644, inherited these Ming structures but modified them. They restricted selection primarily to 8-banner families, elite Manchu and Mongolian clans who formed the dynasty's military backbone. This ethnic restriction transformed the harem into something even more politically calculated, a mechanism for binding the conquest elite together through marriage. Every Manchu noble family wanted their daughter in the palace, not because she'd be empress, but because having a connection to the imperial household meant protection, prestige, and power. Throughout all these transformations, the system's core remained unchanged. One empress, the legal wife, supreme among all women. Below her, consorts and concubines arranged in descending ranks, each level determining not just privileges, but life itself. And woven through everything, managing the machinery, were the eunuchs, castrated men whose own bodies had been sacrificed to serve this system. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. First, you have to be chosen. The Qing Dynasty selection process, occurring every 3 years, reveals the system's machinery in detail. If your family belonged to the 8-banner system, you were registered from birth. Between ages 13 and 16, you received the summons. You had no choice. Failure to appear could destroy your entire family. Marriage offered the only escape, which explains why so many families rushed to arrange betrothals during selection years. On the appointed day, you arrived at the Forbidden City's gate of divine prowess with your family, your clan head, and hundreds of other girls. The first inspection evaluated bodies, posture, movement, voice, hands. Officials measured height. They examined skin. They listened to how you spoke. About 2/3 of candidates were eliminated immediately. Those who survived registered officially as xiunu, elegant females, and underwent intensive testing. Officials evaluated literacy, knowledge of classical texts, artistic abilities. Could you paint, compose poetry, play instruments? Your family's rank mattered enormously, though exceptional beauty or talent could sometimes compensate for lower status. The final selection occurred in the Palace of Heavenly Purity. The Emperor and Empress Dowager made their choices. Perhaps 3 to 10 girls, rarely more. These fortunate few received immediate rank as Imperial concubines. But here's the reveal that changes everything. Being selected didn't mean you'd become a concubine in any romantic sense. The xiunu system chose women for 2 purposes. The emperor might select a handful for potential intimacy, but the remaining 50 to 100 girls, they became palace maids. That's right, the selection system primarily recruited servants, not lovers. Those other girls would spend their lives serving higher-ranking women, managing supplies, cooking, cleaning, maintaining the enormous household. Only a tiny fraction, maybe 1 in 10 selected girls, was ever designated for imperial attention. The rest were just staff. Trapped staff who could never leave and would never advance beyond servitude. During the Ming Dynasty, the process operated even more broadly. All unmarried women over age 14 faced mandatory examination, with only married women or those with certified disabilities exempt. Eunuchs traveled the empire, identifying and recruiting girls from every social class. This meant Ming harems contained far more diversity, though it also meant far more families suffered the loss of daughters who disappeared into palace service and were never heard from again. The medical examination that concluded the process was intimate and humiliating. Court physicians verified virginity, checked for diseases and deformities, and certified each girl as suitable for palace service. Only those passing every test entered the Forbidden City. Once inside, the gates closed with the finality of a tomb ceiling. Once inside, you entered a world governed by rigid hierarchy. The Qing Dynasty system, which operated from 1644 to 1912, consisted of 8 official ranks. Understanding these ranks is essential because they determined literally every aspect of daily existence. At the apex stood the Empress, the Emperor's one legal wife. Only one woman could hold this title at any time. She was called the Mother of the Nation and served as chief administrator of the inner court. The Empress lived in the Palace of Earthly Tranquility at the very heart of the Forbidden City, though by the Qing period, she often resided in the Palace of Eternal Spring. She commanded a personal staff of at least 10 maids and possessed authority over all other women in the palace. Only the Emperor himself and the Empress Dowager, the Emperor's mother, ranked above her. Below the Empress came the Imperial noble Consort. Officially, only one woman could hold this rank, though exceptions occurred. She resided in her own palace within the 6 eastern or 6 western palaces and commanded approximately 8 attendants. Next were 2 noble consorts, then 4 consorts, then 6 imperial concubines. These upper ranks enjoyed significant privileges. Each received her own palace, or at minimum the main quarters of a palace, if she held a lower position in these ranks. They had personal attendants, substantial monthly allowances of silver and goods, and the right to wear specific colors and ornaments. Bright yellow clothing was reserved for the Empress. Golden yellow adorned the higher consorts. Lower ranks wore champagne and other subdued colors. Phoenix imagery decorated the garments of ranked women, with the number of phoenixes indicating status. The lower 3 ranks, noble lady, first-class attendant, and second-class attendant, had no numerical limits. These women could number in the hundreds. They lived communally in side chambers of palaces, often 4 or 6 women sharing cramped quarters. They received minimal allowances and possessed little authority. A noble lady might have 2 or 3 personal servants. First and second-class attendants often had none, serving higher-ranking women themselves while technically maintaining concubine status. Below even these ranks existed a category of women called lady-in-waiting, though this wasn't an official rank. These were palace maids who had been favored by the emperor, perhaps sharing his bed once or twice, but never formally elevated. They occupied a strange liminal space, no longer ordinary servants, but possessing no official recognition or privileges. Your rank determined not just your living space and allowance, but also your daily activities, the quality of your food, your clothing, and critically, your access to the emperor. High-ranking consorts could request audiences. They participated in important ceremonies. They had some control over their schedules. Lower-ranking women had none of these freedoms. They waited, hoping to be noticed, knowing the odds were astronomical. Rank could change. Bearing a son, especially, could trigger immediate promotion. A second-class attendant who delivered a healthy boy might leap to noble lady or even imperial concubine. Demonstrating exceptional talent in calligraphy, poetry, or music could earn incremental advancement. Imperial birthdays and new dasu. Year celebrations sometimes brought promotions as the emperor distributed favors, but rank could also fall. Offending the empress, speaking out of turn, showing jealousy, or committing any of dozens of protocol violations could result in demotion. The most serious offenses, infidelity, treason, or attempting to harm other concubines, brought punishments ranging from demotion to death. Some women found their ranks stripped away entirely, reduced to servitude, or exiled to the cold palace. Those abandoned quarters where disgraced concubines lived out their days in neglect and poverty. What did you actually do all day? Popular imagination pictures concubines lounging in silk, waited upon hand and foot. Reality was far more structured and, for most women, profoundly tedious. Your day began before dawn. The highest-ranking women rose around 5 in the morning. Lower ranks rose earlier to prepare for the needs of their superiors. Morning rituals started with washing and dressing, elaborate processes that could take hours for upper-rank consorts. Hair needed to be styled in complex arrangements specific to rank and occasion. Clothing had to be selected appropriately, with different garments for different types of days. The first formal activity was morning greetings. Lower-ranking women paid respects to higher-ranking women. Everyone paid respects to the Empress. This involved formal bows and specific verbal formulas. The Empress held morning court in her residence, where issues affecting the inner palace were discussed and decided. Disputes between concubines, management of supplies, assignments of tasks, all passed through this morning assembly. After morning duties came breakfast. Food quality varied dramatically by rank. The Empress enjoyed elaborate meals with dozens of dishes, though she was expected to taste only a few bites of each. High-ranking consorts received multiple dishes. Lower ranks ate simpler fare, though still far better than most Chinese. People outside the palace. Food arrived from the Imperial kitchens, prepared by specialized cooks and tasted by eunuchs to ensure it contained no poison. The bulk of the day was filled with refined activities designed to cultivate feminine accomplishments. You studied calligraphy, painting, poetry, and classical texts. You practiced needlework, creating embroidered garments or decorative pieces. High-ranking women might paint or write poetry, their work sometimes presented to the emperor. Musical training was important, learning to play instruments like the guqin or pipa, or developing skill in singing and dance. But these activities, while pleasant, served mainly to fill time. You weren't preparing for a career. You weren't creating art for its own sake. You were maintaining readiness for the unlikely event the emperor might summon you and wish to be entertained. You were also being observed constantly by eunuchs and higher-ranking women. Your behavior, your comments, your relationships with other concubines, all of this was noted and reported. The palace ran on information and intrigue. Social interaction was simultaneously crucial and dangerous. Forming alliances with other concubines could provide protection and support, but trust was always provisional. The woman who seemed your closest friend might betray you if she thought doing so would advance her own position. Jealousy permeated the atmosphere. Any woman could potentially bear the son who would become emperor, and mothers of emperors wielded tremendous power as Empress Dowagers. Physical mobility was severely restricted. You couldn't leave the inner court without explicit permission, which was rarely granted. The Forbidden City's northern section, where the imperial family lived, was separated from the outer court where government business occurred. You could move between the various palaces of the inner court, but guards and eunuchs monitored all movement. The walls that kept outsiders away also kept you imprisoned. Evening brought more rituals. Dinner was formal, especially if you were fortunate enough to be summoned to dine near the emperor, though even then, you might only watch him eat while remaining silent. After evening meals came the process of preparing for possible imperial summons. If the emperor might visit the inner court that night, women of appropriate rank would be informed to bathe, groom, and wait. Most nights the emperor didn't summon anyone. Most nights you prepared for nothing, then returned to your quarters to sleep. Days blurred into weeks, weeks into months, months into years. Many concubines spent entire lifetimes in the palace without ever speaking to the emperor. They grew old in those rooms, surrounded by silk and jade, starving for meaningful human contact, waiting for attention that never came. How did the emperor actually choose women for the night? This process combined elaborate ritual with imperial whim, regulated by eunuchs who wielded surprising power through their control of access. The system of green headpieces illustrates the mechanical nature of imperial intimacy. These were small plaques made of wood or ivory, inscribed with the name of each woman eligible for summons. They were stored in a special location accessible to the emperor. When he wished company for the night, he would flip over the piece bearing his chosen woman's name. A eunuch would then inform that woman to prepare herself. She would undergo a thorough bathing, dress in special garments, and be examined by an imperial physician to confirm she was healthy and free from disease. The examination was intimate and humiliating, designed to ensure no illness could pass to the emperor. Only after this certification could she proceed. The method of reaching the emperor's chambers became legendary, though accounts vary. Some sources claim lower-ranking concubines were wrapped naked in special blankets and carried by eunuchs to the imperial bed, deposited at the foot, and required to crawl up from the bottom to avoid seeming to rise above the emperor. Higher-ranking consorts were escorted more respectfully, but still under eunuch supervision. Timing of these encounters followed astrological principles tied to the lunar calendar. Traditional Chinese cosmology held that the full moon represented the peak of yin energy, feminine force, which made it the optimal time for conception. During the full moon period, the empress and highest-ranking consorts enjoyed priority access to the emperor, as children conceived at this time were believed to possess exceptional virtue and strength. Lower-ranking concubines were typically summoned around the new moon, when yin energy was weaker. These encounters were considered less auspicious for conception, though still necessary to nourish the emperor's yang, masculine force, with feminine energy. This created a system where a concubine's rank determined not only how often she might be called, but also when during the lunar month. The actual intimate encounter was time-limited and monitored. Eunuchs waited outside the bedchamber. After a prescribed period, sources suggest anywhere from 30 minutes to 2 hours, eunuchs would announce that time was complete. The emperor was expected to dismiss his companion, who would be escorted back to her quarters. All of this, the date, the time, the woman's name, was meticulously recorded in official registers. Why such documentation? These records served multiple purposes. They tracked the emperor's health and vigor. They established paternity beyond question when pregnancies occurred, and they provided a form of control. Even the emperor's most private acts became state business, managed and recorded by the bureaucracy that ran the palace. Some emperors rebelled against this regimentation. Emperor Zhengde of the Ming Dynasty, ruling from 1505 to 1521, became notorious for his sexual excesses and refusal to follow established protocols. He kept concubines outside the Forbidden City, engaged with Muslim Central Asian women provided by foreign officials, and generally scandalized the court. But such behavior was exceptional. Most emperors, raised from childhood within the system, accepted these structures as natural. For concubines, the experience of being summoned was fraught with anxiety. This represented your opportunity, perhaps your only opportunity, to catch the emperor's interest. If you pleased him, you might be summoned again. You might conceive a child. But the pressure was immense, the situation artificial, and the emperor a stranger who possessed absolute power over your life. Pleasure was not the point. Survival and advancement were. Nothing changed a concubine's status more dramatically than pregnancy. The birth of an imperial child, particularly a son, could transform a low-ranking attendant into a high-ranking consort virtually overnight. This made childbearing the supreme form of political capital in the harem. The moment a pregnancy was confirmed, the woman's rank often increased. Her allowances expanded. She received better quarters if she didn't already possess them. Additional servants attended her. The empress took direct interest in her health, not from kindness necessarily, but because every potential heir represented political opportunity and danger. Pregnancy in the palace involved elaborate medical care. Imperial physicians monitored the expectant mother closely. Her diet was carefully controlled, with specific foods believed to promote healthy male children. She might be exempted from some ceremonial duties, though her movements remained restricted. The pregnancy became court knowledge, with factions forming around the expectant mother based on her family connections and the political moment. Childbirth occurred in the woman's residence, attended by experienced midwives, court physicians, and eunuchs who managed the logistics. the empress or omais, high-ranking representative, would be present. The moment of birth determined much. A son brought rejoicing, a daughter disappointment. The sex of the child was immediately reported to the emperor, who would decide on appropriate rewards or acknowledgments. But here's where the system becomes even more complex. Mothers didn't raise their own children. Wet nurses took over almost immediately. The Qing court maintained an elaborate wet nurse system. When a birth was imminent, the imperial household employed 40 wet nurses and 80 substitutes, chosen from women aged 14 to 19 whose own children were healthy. These wet nurses and their husbands underwent thorough examinations to ensure health and fitness. A specific rule governed wet nurse assignments. Imperial sons were nursed by women whose own children were daughters, and vice versa. This was meant to balance yin and yang energies, and also to prevent any possibility of infant substitution. Wet nurses received generous compensation, clothing allowances, daily rations of rice and meat, coal for heating, and significant prestige. Their service lasted months or years, during which they saw the imperial child more frequently than the birth mother. Why separate mothers from children? Several reasons intersected. Practically, it freed high-ranking concubines from the physical demands of breastfeeding, preserving their appearance and allowing them to become pregnant again more quickly. Politically, it prevented the formation of strong maternal bonds that might interfere with the emperor's control over succession. Sons belonged to the emperor, not to their mothers. Raising them separately reinforced this truth. The birth of a son catapulted a concubine into the succession politics that dominated court life. Her son became a potential heir, with his position depending partly on his mother's rank. Sons of the empress enjoyed highest status, even if born after sons of concubines. But if the empress produced no sons, the game opened completely. Different factions backed different princes, supporting their mothers, forming alliances, and maneuvering for advantage. Mothers of princes lived in a peculiar state of elevated anxiety. Their status had risen, but so had the danger. If their son seemed likely to become emperor, they might find themselves courted by ambitious officials and protected by powerful supporters. But they also became targets. Rival mothers might work to discredit them or harm their sons. Court intrigue could turn lethal, with poisonings, false accusations, and political machinations ending lives or destroying reputations. If a son did become emperor, his mother achieved the ultimate triumph, the rank of Empress Dowager. She would wield enormous power, sometimes ruling as regent if her son ascended while young. The most famous example is Empress Dowager Cixi, who entered the palace as a low-ranking concubine in the 1850s, bore the Xianfeng emperor's only surviving son, and then dominated Chinese politics for nearly 50 years after her son became the Tongji emperor. But for every success story, hundreds of women bore daughters or sons who died young or never approached the throne. These women gained some status from motherhood, but remained essentially prisoners, now with the additional pain of being separated from their children, watching eunuchs and wet nurses raise the people they had borne. No discussion of the harem is complete without examining the eunuchs, castrated men who managed nearly every aspect of life in the inner court, seeing everything, controlling access, and through those roles accumulating power that sometimes rivaled the highest government officials. Eunuchs had served Chinese emperors since at least the 8th century BCE. The logic was straightforward. Women of the imperial harem needed male servants for heavy labor and administration, but these servants couldn't be intact men who might impregnate the emperor's women. Castration solved this problem, at least theoretically. By the Ming Dynasty, approximately 100,000 eunuchs served the imperial court. The Qing Dynasty reduced this to perhaps 2,000 in the Forbidden City proper. Even that reduced number meant eunuchs dominated the inner court's daily operations. How did men become eunuchs? Some were castrated as punishment. Others were captured in war and forcibly castrated. But many were volunteers from desperately poor families. Parents might have a young son castrated, hoping he could enter palace service and eventually support them. The operation was dangerous and frequently fatal, but poverty made desperate measures seem reasonable. Their duties ranged from menial to crucial. Lower-ranking eunuchs cleaned and maintained buildings. Mid-level eunuchs managed supplies and served as personal attendants to concubines. The highest-ranking eunuchs controlled access to the emperor, managed his schedule, and supervised all inner court operations. This power derived from position, not formal authority. A eunuch could decide which messages reached the emperor and which didn't. He could delay summons requests or expedite them. He could whisper suggestions about which concubine to favor or warn against others. All of this made them essential and dangerous. The relationship between eunuchs and concubines was complex. Some formed genuine bonds, becoming trusted confidants. But abuse was common. Eunuchs sometimes extorted money from concubines, threatening to report invented offenses. Lower-ranking women, with no powerful protectors, were particularly vulnerable. For concubines, eunuchs were necessary intermediaries to a world they couldn't access directly. Need to message your family? A eunuch carried it. Want to present artwork to the emperor? Eunuchs facilitated that. Fall ill? Eunuchs summoned physicians. Your survival and any hope of advancement depended on maintaining good relationships with the eunuchs around. What happened when you lost favor? The system included mechanisms for punishing concubines who violated rules, offended the emperor, or simply became inconvenient. Punishments ranged from mild rebukes to death, with the most infamous being relegation to the Cold Palace. The Cold Palace, Linggong in Chinese, wasn't actually a specific building. It referred to any neglected, remote quarters within the Forbidden City where disgraced concubines were confined. These were typically older structures in poor repair, far from where the emperor spent his time. Being sent there meant exile within the palace, physically present but socially dead. Life there was deliberately harsh. Minimal supplies. Irregular, poor quality food. No firewood for heating in winter, leading to genuine suffering during Beijing's cold months, hence the name. Few servants, no cleaning beyond what confined women could manage. The physical space deteriorated, becoming damp, moldy, and infested. But the Chunnasid's psychological punishment exceeded the physical deprivation. You weren't formally dead, so there were no funeral rites or closure for your family. You simply disappeared into forgotten rooms, cut off from all social contact, with no hope of redemption. Many women reportedly went blind from crying. Some went mad from isolation. Most waited for death. The story of Consort Gong illustrates this cruelty. In 1581, palace maid Wang caught Emperor Wanli's attention during a drunken moment. When she became pregnant, the emperor initially denied paternity, but his mother forced acknowledgement. Grudgingly, he granted her the title, Consort Gong, but refused to see her again. Consort Gong spent decades in the Palace of Great Brilliance, which became synonymous with the Cold Palace because of her suffering. She was neglected so completely that she had no access to medical care for her worsening eyesight. By the time her son, Zhu Changluo, was finally named Crown Prince after 30 years, Consort, Gong was blind and elderly. When her son visited her in 1601, she could only clutch his robes through tears, murmuring that now she could die without regret. She died that same night. The most severe punishment was execution. Concubines accused of attempting to poison rivals, engaging in forbidden relationships, or participating in conspiracies faced death. The Ming Dynasty founder initiated a practice of forcing concubines to commit suicide or having them buried alive when emperors died. Emperor Zhengtong abolished this in 1464, though the Qing Dynasty briefly revived forced suicide before eventually abandoning it. For living concubines, the constant threat of punishment created an atmosphere of fear. Any misstep could result in disaster, encouraging conformity and silence, but also breeding paranoia. Women learned to watch each other constantly, reporting suspicious behavior to curry favor or eliminate rivals. Some women transcended the system's limitations through extraordinary combinations of intelligence, ruthlessness, and opportunity. Wu Zetian stands as the most remarkable example. A woman who entered the palace as a low-ranking concubine and became China's first and only female emperor. Not empress, emperor. She entered the Tang court in 638 CE at age 14 as a fifth-tier concubine to Emperor Taizong, essentially a maid who occasionally warmed the imperial bed. But Wu was educated, ambitious, and observant. She learned how power worked. When Taizong died in 649, Wu should have spent the rest of her life in a Buddhist nunnery, the standard fate for deceased emperors' concubines. Instead, she had already formed a connection with Taizong's son, the crown prince, who became Emperor Gaozong. In an unprecedented move, Gaozong brought Wu back to the palace as his own concubine. What happened next became one of history's most debated events. In 654, Wu gave birth to a daughter. The infant died within days, and Wu accused Empress Wang of murdering the child out of jealousy. Wang, who had reportedly been seen near the child's quarters, had no alibi. She was found guilty and banished. But here's where history gets murky. Traditional Chinese histories, written decades or centuries later by Confucian scholars who despised Wu for violating patriarchal norms, claim Wu killed her own daughter and framed Wang. Modern historians remain deeply divided on what actually happened. Some believe Wu committed infanticide as a calculated political move. Others suggest the baby died from what we'd now call SIDS, sudden infant death syndrome, and Wu simply exploited the tragedy to eliminate a rival. Still others point out that Wu would have been closely monitored, making secret murder nearly impossible without witnesses, and that rival concubines would have eagerly reported any suspicious behavior. We'll likely never know the truth. The sources are too biased, the forensic evidence non-existent. What we do know is this: Wang was deposed. Wu became empress in 655 CE, and she quickly eliminated threats with methodical precision. When Emperor Gaozong suffered from declining health, Wu increasingly managed state affairs. After his death in 683 CE, she served as regent for her sons. First one, then another. Neither proved compliant. In 690 CE, Wu took an unprecedented step. She declared herself emperor, founding the Zhou dynasty with herself as supreme ruler, not regent, not Empress Dowager working behind the scenes. Emperor. She ruled for 15 years until 705 CE, and by most objective measures, she governed capably. She reformed the civil service examination system, promoting officials based on merit rather than aristocratic birth. She expanded China's borders through successful military campaigns. She patronized Buddhism, commissioning magnificent temples and sculptures. Agriculture flourished. The economy grew. But Wu also ruled through terror. She employed secret police who encouraged anonymous denunciations. Suspected, rivals were executed or forced to commit suicide. She had former Empress Wang and Consort Xiao horrifically tortured before death, reportedly having their hands and feet cut off and their bodies drowned in wine vats. Even members of her own family weren't safe. Relatives who threatened her power met similar fates. Was Wu unusually cruel, or simply as ruthless as any male emperor would have been, to maintain power in a society where her rule was considered an abomination against nature? Scholars continue debating this. What's undeniable is that her success was so extraordinary precisely because it was so rare, and because the price she paid in blood helped enable it. 1,000 years later, another concubine would follow a different path to power. Empress Dowager Cixi entered the Forbidden City in 1851 at age 16 as a low-ranking concubine to the Xianfeng Emperor, one voice among thousands. But in 1856, she bore his only surviving son, instantly transforming her position. When Xianfeng died in 1861, that son became the Tongzhi Emperor at age 5. Cixi maneuvered brilliantly during the succession crisis, staging a coup with the Empress and key officials against the Regency Council Xianfeng had appointed. She became co-regent and never let go. For 47 years, Cixi dominated Chinese politics. When Tongzhi died in 1875, she installed her nephew as the Guangxu Emperor, maintaining control. Even after he came of age, she wielded real power, placing him under house arrest in 1898 when he attempted reforms threatening her authority. Cixi's legacy remains complicated. She resisted modernization that might have helped China confront Western imperialism, yet she abolished foot binding and attempted educational reforms. She accumulated staggering personal wealth while China struggled. She ruled a crumbling dynasty with an iron fist, demonstrating that a concubine could seize and hold power, but also that power alone couldn't save an empire whose time had passed. Both Wu and Cixi proved that the system wasn't absolutely constraining. Exceptional women could transcend it, but their rarity, 2 women across 13 centuries, reveals how extraordinary you had to be to escape. For every Wu Zetian, 10,000 concubines died anonymously. For every Cixi, countless women spent lifetimes waiting for opportunities that never came. Not every notable concubine story ends in triumph. The Imperial Harem produced at least as many tragedies as success stories. 2 cases in particular illustrate the vulnerability and heartbreak that could result from imperial favor. Yang Guifei in the Tang Dynasty and Consort Zhen in the Qing. Yang Yuhuan, known by her title Yang Guifei or prized concubine Yang, was one of ancient China's 4 great beauties. Born in 719 CE, she initially married into the imperial family as the wife of one of Emperor Xuanzong's sons. According to legend, Xuanzong saw her bathing in hot springs and was immediately smitten. He arranged for her to become a Taoist nun, annulling her marriage, then brought her into his own harem in 745 CE. She was 26, he was 60. Yang Guifei quickly became Xuanzong's absolute favorite. He lavished attention and gifts upon her. Her family received noble titles and important positions. The emperor famously ordered fresh lychees delivered to her from southern China, using the imperial courier system, horses racing through the night to ensure the fruit arrived before spoiling. This extravagance became legendary, symbolizing both the emperor's devotion and his growing neglect of state affairs. But Yang Guifei's favor brought danger. As the emperor spent more time with her and less time governing, resentment grew among officials and military commanders. In 755 CE, General An Lushan, who had been befriended by Yang Guifei and her cousin, launched a massive rebellion that nearly destroyed the Tang Dynasty. The emperor fled the capital with Yang Guifei and a small retinue. During the flight, imperial troops mutinied. They blamed Yang Guifei and her family for the rebellion and the chaos that had engulfed the realm. The soldiers demanded her death as the price for continuing to protect the emperor. Xuanzong, though heartbroken, had no choice. Yang Guifei was strangled with a silk cord in 756 CE. She was 37 years old. Xuanzong reportedly never recovered from her death. He abdicated soon after, spending his remaining years in grief and regret. Poets, particularly Bai Juyi, in his famous Song of Everlasting Regret, immortalized their tragic love story. But Yang Guifei's fate demonstrates how imperial favor could become fatal. Her beauty and the emperor's infatuation destroyed not just her life, but nearly destroyed the dynasty itself. Consort Zhen's story, though less famous internationally, is equally poignant. Born in 1876 during the late Qing dynasty, she and her older sister Consort, Zhen, both entered the Forbidden City in 1889, when Zhen was 13. She became a favorite of the Guangxu Emperor, not just for her beauty, but for her intelligence and lively personality. She learned photography, a modern technology, and even took portraits of the emperor and other concubines, an unprecedented activity. Consort Zhen's relationship with Guangxu went beyond the purely formal. They appear to have developed genuine affection. She supported his attempts at political reform, including the 100 Days Reform of 1898, which sought to modernize China's government and military. But these reforms threatened the power of Empress Dowager Cixi, who staged a coup, placed Guangxu under house arrest, and executed many reformers. Consort Zhen was also punished. Cixi demoted her and placed her under house arrest in a small, isolated building. For 2 years, Zhen lived in solitary confinement, unable to see the emperor or even her sister. She was 22 years old, confined to a tiny space with no freedom, no company, no hope. In 1900, the Eight-Nation Alliance invaded Beijing to suppress the Boxer Rebellion. As foreign troops approached the Forbidden City, Cixi and the court prepared to flee to Xi'an. But Cixi didn't want to take Consort Zhen with them. According to the most common account, she ordered a eunuch to drown Consort Zhen in a well. Zhen was 24 when she died, her body thrown into the narrow shaft of what is now called the Guifei well. The well remains in the Forbidden City today, a tourist site that marks her tragic end. After Cixi's death in 1908, Guangxu's successor rehabilitated Consort Zhen's reputation, recovering her body and giving her a proper burial with honors befitting an imperial consort. But this posthumous justice couldn't undo her suffering or restore her life. Both Yang Guifei and Consort Zhen illustrate how dangerous imperial favor could be. Yang died because her emperor's devotion led to political disaster. Zhen died because she sided with her emperor against someone more powerful. Their stories remind us that concubines existed not as individuals with rights, but as pieces in political games they couldn't control. Beauty, intelligence, and even imperial love offered no protection against the system's cruelty. The imperial harem system lasted more than 2,000 years, surviving dynasty after dynasty, until the Qing collapse in 1912. Concubinage itself wasn't outlawed in China until 1949. That means women in your grandmother's lifetime might have lived this reality. The Forbidden City still stands in Beijing, its palaces preserved as museums. You can visit the Palace of Great Brilliance, where Consort Gong cried herself blind. You can peer into the Guifei well. The architecture photographs beautifully. But standing in those courtyards, you realize something troubling. The buildings have survived better than the women's stories. We know the architecture in exquisite detail. The women themselves, most remain anonymous. Here's the final reveal, the one that recontextualizes everything we've discussed. We've talked tonight about perhaps 20 women by name, 20 stories across 2 millennia. But millions of women passed through the harem system. Millions. 20,000 in a single reign. Tens of thousands across each dynasty. Over 2,000 years, the numbers become almost incomprehensible. And we remember 20 of them. The mathematics of this erasure are as brutal as the system itself. For every Wu Zetian who became emperor, roughly 100,000 concubines lived and died anonymously. For every Yang Guifei immortalized in poetry, 10,000 women waited in rooms where no poet would ever memorialize them. The system wasn't designed to be remembered. It was designed to function. To bind powerful families to the throne through daughters who became political insurance policies. To demonstrate imperial supremacy through sheer scale. To create an administrative machine that processed women as efficiently as the bureaucracy processed tax revenues or military recruits. And it worked perfectly. It worked for 2,000 years. That's what should haunt us. Not that it was brutal, but that it was sustainable. Generation after generation, families sent daughters into those vermillion-walled compounds. Generation after generation, girls became ghosts, their lives meaningful only if they bore the right son at the right time. Perhaps the most chilling thing isn't the cold palace, or the forced suicides, or even the green headpieces flipped like lottery tickets. It's the efficiency. The calm, methodical, bureaucratic efficiency of a system that turned human beings into inventory, tracked in ledgers, assigned ranks, and ultimately forgotten. When you visit the Forbidden City today, tour guides tell you about the emperors. They show you throne rooms and ritual spaces. The women's quarters exist, but they're secondary. An afterthought, just like the women themselves were, present in enormous numbers, essential to the system's functioning, but ultimately supporting characters in someone else's story. That's the real tragedy. Not just what happened, but what didn't happen. All those voices we'll never hear. All those minds that might have contributed something remarkable if they'd been given opportunities beyond waiting in silk-lined rooms. All that human potential transformed into nothing more than a mechanism for producing heirs and maintaining power. The concubines of Imperial China deserve to be remembered not as exotic fantasy figures or symbols of ancient oppression, but as real people who lived constrained lives within an impossible system. They were teenagers torn from families. They were mothers separated from children. They were old women who'd spent 60 years waiting for moments that never came. They were, in the end, just people, trying to survive, finding small joys where they could, hoping for better tomorrows that the system was designed to deny them. If you found this journey into history's most gilded cage compelling, consider subscribing to Sleepable History. We bring carefully researched stories to life, exploring the overlooked corners where real people lived, real lives under extraordinary circumstances. Hit the like button and leave a comment. Which woman's story affected you most deeply? There are thousands more voices waiting to be heard, countless lives that deserve remembering. We'll continue bringing them to you, one truth at a time. Thank you for listening.